the church had maintained a kind of faithfulness with the original church community, and that was in the monasteries. Now, the monasteries came up out of the felt need of many people to be truly, to live truly as Christians. In other words, like the first Christians in small communities, intense, deeply intense religious life, community life. Really, the picture you will find there, a typical medieval monastery, in the church there, behind the walls, these are the place where the monks would live. Outside, they would have the farms, and many of them cultivated by the slaves. Now, so the monastery represented the ideal of Christian life. In the context of a church empire union, it becomes so big, you don't feel anymore the immediacy of the spiritual experience, the religious experience that was there, very present among the early Christians. So people who wanted to do that would like to come together and form a kind of a community. And that is how monastery came to be started. Benedict started the Western monasticism. So they started to form. But even before that, talk about the Desert Fathers, who were also monks in their own right. What they were really striving for is a more intense spiritual life. So they wanted to experience that. But it also meant that they are going to abandon secular life. In other words, they will not be involved in politics. They will not be involved in commerce, being merchants or being traders, but they will be involved mostly with prayer, with spiritual life, and with maybe cultic part. So always much more on the religious part, because they always thought that religious life, spiritual life is much more important than material well-being. But of course, monks also had to live, so they had to maintain a farm. They had to maintain cows and cattle for their milk and for their meat, and maybe even pigs and poultry, because they needed to survive. Okay. Now, this has attracted a number of prominent persons. In the eastern part, Gregory of Nazianzen, for example, who was already a bishop, he decided to abandon being a bishop because he wanted to enter a monastery. In other words, he wanted a more deeply spiritual life. I don't know whether you know what's happening in the church today. Some of the bishops who have retired as bishops and who wanted a more spiritual kind of life, or spiritual life of waiting for the departure, waiting for his death, would enter the monastery. And if there are some bishops who have been found unworthy for their offenses, for their sins, etc., where do they place them? In the monasteries, so that they would lead a life of solitude and of prayer. That is still the mentality that comes with us. Okay? So the role of the monasteries. The monasteries were also the centers of education, because they were involved. Not only did they study the works of the fathers, they were the ones transcribing the works of the fathers, or copying the works of the fathers. The works of Augustine, for example, were copied in the monasteries. The Bible were copied in the monasteries. Eventually, this was long before the invention of the printing press. So they were the ones who were the centers of education, whereas the population outside of the monasteries were illiterate. They did not know anything. They were not educated. So when you talk about going to leaders, who will you choose? Of course, you will choose the ones who are literate. Eventually, these schools, what we call the monastic schools, develop into what is called the colleges, different colleges, a level of higher education. And eventually, of course, the universities grew out of these monastic schools. That's how the universities and the colleges got started. So the local church at this time, of course, before, the local church was autonomous. self-sufficient, and insular, in a way that if a bishop has a diocese under him, then he takes care of the bishop, and all the things, all the issues that need to be resolved are resolved within the diocese itself. But when his Christianity started to grow, of course, then you cannot just be so insulated to yourself. In fact, if you want to be considered as part of the universal church, you have to be able to get in touch with the other regional dioceses in order for you to consider as one with them. In other words, in collegiality with the other bishops. This was the beginning of the sense of collegiality. So unity in the early church was much more unity in faith. We all believe in one faith, but in terms of how we do things, well, kanya-kanya, according to your culture. If you are a Roman, you do this. If you are Greek, you do this. If you are Ethiopian, you do that. If you are Syrian, you do this. So kanya-kanya. But in terms of faith, we are one. We believe in one. We believe in Jesus Christ. We believe in the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. So the bishop was the patriarch of an extended family with very close ties to the community. He knows his people. He smells the odor of his people, as Pope Francis would say. But afterwards, around this time, the church expanded exponentially, so there were more people to take care of. The organizational structures in the order of authority, of course, was needed because you're now dealing with a bigger population. So decisions were no longer depended on the bishop of the place. It had to involve the other bishops in the region because, of course, we need to collaborate to make sure that one bishop is not different from the other bishop, especially if we are just contiguous with one another. We should be able to think in the same way. And eventually were made in episcopal synods, in councils. Okay, so this is the origin of synods, the origin of synods. It is the place where we resolve issues that concern a much bigger part of the population. Where before the bishop represented the people at the synods, now the bishop represents the decisions of the synods to his people. Before, the bishop would ask his people, what do you think about this? Cha, 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 cha. And the people would make a suggestion. Especially if he had a council of elders, they would make suggestions to him. So the idea, the perspective of the people were brought to the bishop. Later on, when the bishop becomes so big, his role became so big, it is now decisions being made in the synods, in the councils. The duty now of the bishop is to tell the people, this is the decision of the council. So from the bottom up, what do you call this process, from the people to the bishop, it became now from the top down, from the council to the bishop, down to the people. So all the people had to do was to obey what the bishop had said, even if they disagreed. Even if the experience was different, because the bishop had spoken, we have to accept that. You see, there's a big difference. It's a big difference. The bishop, instead of being leader, the bishop, instead of being leader of his community, becomes an administrator who is accountable to the higher authority. So the bishop is no longer just the leader. He is now, I am now above you. If you are the leader, you are one among the members of the community. But if I am above you, I have authority over you. I am much more an administrator, especially if you're talking about the priest who is under the bishop. And the bishop orders the priest, you take care of this community, so you will be the one administrator for this particular section of the church. The diaconate around this time lost its prestigious position from the pre-Constantinian times, when he was by the side of the Pope, beside of the bishop. Even in our ordination rite, the deacon is always on the side of the bishop, not the priest, but always the deacon. Okay. At this time, however, his role in the liturgy was limited to assisting the priest. And what kind of work is that? Mostly reading the gospel, or mostly opening the books, or mostly bringing the vessels. In other words, functional role, and mostly around the cultic activities. So archdeacons, however, had a higher role. They were the so-called assistants to the bishops, of the bishops, especially in the administrative administration of the diocese. This is the precursor of what we now know as the diocesan chancellor or the vicar general. They were actually the archdeacons. And so the bishop, because he would like to keep his favorite priest as a chancellor or his secretary or his vicar general, would give them the title Monsignor. So the title became part of the benefits of being close to the bishop. You are special counselor of the bishop, so you are a Monsignor. Okay. Those of you aspiring to be Monsignor, know your roots. Now, the power of
Father,
orders.
clarification po. Where
Yes,
does these titles like Very Reverend Father, Right Reverend Monsignor, where do they come from?
depends on your position. Well, it's something that is part of the structure of the Roman organization. These are titles that you use for certain people because we are basically a hierarchical institution. So you would like to distinguish between those who are intending, those who are pretending, and those who are contending bishops or
So,
people.
thank you,
So
thank you, Father.
one would be called Reverend Father or just Reverend, you normally use for the word deacon.
I usually hear it, Father, when it is for a certain rector of seminary. So he is called as, I mean, addressed as Very Reverend Father, and
Yes,
then for the superintendent of the Archdiocesan School, he is the Right Reverend Monsignor.
okay. All right. You better know that the rector of the seminary is very reverend. Huh? He deserves it. You know, the rector of the seminary deserves the title very reverend. Okay, you, you can you can put that very reverend in a wastebasket. And anyway, as far as I'm concerned, but very reverend is normally for a person who has a higher position that is not a bishop, who is not a bishop. The bishop is always most reverend, as if there is a mostest reverend bishop. Maybe for the archbishop, we say mostest reverend. But the bishop is normally called most reverend. Monsignors are called right reverends. Okay. And then those who hold positions, let's say even the provincial superior is can always addressed as very reverend. The rector of a seminary is also called very reverend. But when he's no longer the rector of a seminary, then he's just called reverend father. Okay, that's the nicest thing about in the religious life. You know, when you no longer become a superior, when you no longer become, you're back to square one, reverend father.
As if he was demoted of the position already.
Yes, as far as those people who are worried about those titles, you know. But as far as he is concerned, he could care less whether it's reverend or just simply Manuel Hinete. That's just enough. Okay. Now, there are two powers here. We're talking about the power of orders, which come through ordination. But also another power is the power of jurisdiction, the power of jurisdiction. The power of jurisdiction comes supposed to be with the ordination, but it is given as a separate power by the bishop. And how do we explain that? By ordination, I can hear confession, right? I can perform sacraments. I can do that. Okay? All right. But if I do not have the jurisdiction of the power of jurisdiction given to me by the bishop, then I cannot hear confession in his diocese. I cannot baptize in his diocese. I cannot say mass in his diocese. Okay? That's important because for the diocesans, when you go to another diocese, you have to secure the permission of the local bishop. or the local bishop can very easily tell you, hey, don't say mass here in my diocese. I don't give you jurisdiction. So we talk about the healing priest who is forbidden by the bishop to administer sacraments or to say mass in a particular diocese. The bishop has the right to do that because that is part of the jurisdiction, the power of jurisdiction. Okay, okay, he's ordained priest. Okay, for the religious, however, the religious are normally given power of the ordination, but they are able to say to celebrate the sacraments, to celebrate mass, to hear confession in any place where the congregation is found. Okay, so that's more generally. So, for example, my original diocese is Sorsogon. When I got to Sorsogon before, when what do you call this, Bishop Bastes was there, and even before him, when the old bishop, when I would go to Sorsogon, or the first time I went back to the diocese, I was given, for as long as you come to Sorsogon, you can do all the sacraments, you can do the baptism, you can do without the confirmation, of course, but you can do the sacraments, you can hear confessions, etc. So I need that ask for that faculty. We call it the faculty, which is basically the power of jurisdiction. So it is important, but in this given instance, they divided that into the two separate powers. You're ordained, okay, you're ordained, you can say mass. But if you are just given the power of, if you're not properly given the power of jurisdiction by the bishop, if the bishop doesn't approve of you to celebrate the sacraments, then you cannot celebrate the sacraments there. But in general, because you're ordained, you can celebrate mass, but not in his diocese, but in other dioceses. Okay, so now the net effect, however, of this is that the power of ordination, you remember that it was rooted in the consent of the community. Who becomes bishop during the early years was always a product of the decision of the community, suggestion, recommendation coming from the community. Now that it becomes the power of the bishop, it is now a power from above, not no longer a power from below. So that power is granted to you by a higher authority. So you need to be careful. You need to respect that power. Okay. Whether do you agree or disagree with this theologically or even canonically, uh, the bishop has a right to enforce this particular regulation because in the present scheme of things, he has the right to do it. Now, this also became the time when the spiritual and the profane became more and more distinguished. Again, we talk about the monasteries. The monks were the ones who wanted to take care of their spiritual needs in a very, very conscious way, in a very intense way. So anything that is not considered as spiritual, which is what the monks do, are considered profane. Okay? So almost like what we would find in Neoplatonism, whatever is there within the realm of the spiritual or the religious would be something that is higher, of higher value than the things that are outside of it. In other words, material things, politics, economics, uh, business and trade, etc. Uh, those are so the division between the spiritual and the profane, the sacred and the ordinary, material, human part of existence. Now, that dichotomy became more and more pronounced as centuries came by. So, the monk's life of detachment from the world and the quest for spiritual perfection soon created the mentality that the world the monks were fleeing from was the world of the profane, inhabited by spirits that were not sacred and maybe even inhabited by sinners. By sinners. So, if you want to be holy, you enter the monastery. Can you be holy in the world? With great difficulty, because there are always temptations there. That mentality is still with us. So the dichotomy of the sacred and the spiritual and the profane material. would have very, very deep repercussions, not only on spirituality, but also on church ministry. The minister is the ordained priest. If you are not ordained, you cannot be a minister. Why? Because you do not have the power of ordination. So when you say the lector is also a minister, well, he's a quasi minister. He is a kind of a minister. Or some people even say, well, he's a minister because the priest delegated his ministerial role to him, which is even worse. Okay. So that the dichotomy came to be uh, more and more pronounced. Now, the bishops became spiritual and temporal rulers. To the great benefit of the church, and of course, the great headache of the church also. Because with the wealth came also problems and conflicts. They were temporal leaders with equal power, sometimes with the civil leaders. And so when they, for example, the two would disagree, the church leader and the civil leader would disagree, anong gagawin ng obispo? I will excommunicate you. Okay. Or the emperor or the civil leader would say, okay, I will tell my police, my army to surround your church. Okay. And then the church would say, okay, I'm going to declare an interdict on this town. Nobody should touch that town until it is again brought back to communion with the church. That's the power play in the church. Exercise of church and church power and civil power. From this temporal and spiritual union would come the papal states, as well as the papal guards. Okay, those Swiss guards, they came from way, way back. They were real army. They were the real army of the Pope, because the Pope was not only a spiritual leader, but also a temporal leader. And he had properties to guard and to protect. They were called the papal states. Practically all of Italy was a papal state. A good part of Italy, by the way, was papal state. What does it mean? The revenue of the papal states go to the Pope, not to any other person, but to the Pope, because he is the owner of those states. That's the kind of power. Now, with the independence of Italy in 1800s, the late 1800s, came, of course, the confiscation of the papal states. It became now Italy, the group of Italy, which is actually Italy is a union of the papal states plus other what we would call kingdoms, the kingdom of Naples and the kingdom of the north in Milan, which is part of the French kingdom. Okay. While gaining temporal powers, the church leaders somehow lost the aura of spiritual leadership. If you are too busy trying to find out how big the crop, how big the harvest was, you will not have enough time to to hear confession or to give advice to people who are having problems or to take care of their spiritual needs or to catechize them according to about the Bible, etc. You will not have. You're too busy organizing, administering your property. Okay. To assert this spiritual power, the bishops and popes relied on the coercion of church law. So, okay, we have civil law, according to civil law, but the church leaders were very wise. We also have our law, and we call it canon law. Huh? Canon law. It's called canon law. Law that you eat. Canon law. Okay. Unsa man natin kaonon? Okay. To assert his spiritual power, the popes and the bishops relied on the coercion of church law. In the process, justifying the monarchical and hierarchical structure of the church rooted in the character of orders. In other words, rooted in their position as the top leaders in the church, not rooted in the sense of community that was the original idea of the church in the early years of Christianity. How did they understand Roman primacy? The power of the Pope thus become Roman primacy, came to be interpreted vertically, again from a feudal structure. The top, if the top of the empire of the feudal system is the emperor, and then the kings, the individual kings, and then the vassals, and then the nobilities, and then of course the people, and then the slaves. Same kind of a hierarchical structure would be operative in the church. So at the very top is the Pope. So the Pope started to claim primacy, primacy over the other bishops. Before, it was the first among equals, especially when we talk about the five patriarchates, the first among equals, the first of five patriarchs. He was the so-called leader of the five patriarchates. Okay. But nowadays, with a feudal and a monarchical kind of a structure, they would claim, I have the sole authority. I have the absolute authority. And some of the people in the East, Eastern Church, felt like they were being disrespected. Now, because the Pope was imposing his will on them, even if they disagreed. Or unilaterally, the Pope would just say, this is my opinion and you have to follow me. I am the head, you have to follow me. This became the understanding of Roman primacy. This has replaced the power of church leaders being more collegial, being more co-responsible, especially among bishops and especially among patriarchs. Roman primacy was no longer situated within the episcopacy, first among equals. He was now the top, and the rest are under him. He was above the other bishops. From this would come the impression that bishops are simply the errand boys of the Pope in different parts of the world. You ask many lay people, and they always say, well, the bishops are only, what do you call this, the followers of the Pope. And whatever the Pope says, the bishops will obey, because the Pope is higher than the bishops. To a certain extent, yes, it's true. The Pope is higher than the bishops. But Vatican II reminds us that all bishops form a collegial group, meaning they should be making decisions together as a college, together. Of course, the leader is the Pope, yes, but they should be making decisions together, not just unilaterally. Just the Pope saying, this is what I want, I don't need to consult you. That is not the way it was understood at the beginning. Now, the priests. What kind of priests did we have? Well, the bishops were chosen from among the nobility and the upper crust of the empire. They would serve as spiritual leaders, but mostly as temporal rulers. Those under him, the priests, could either be, only one either, could either be well-educated members of the clergy in urban centers because they were members of the nobility, or they were poorly trained, some of them even illiterate, but had to be ordained only because someone was needed to celebrate Mass or to provide sacramental service. You know, this last was a situation that Vincent de Paul faced in 1600. Remember, we're talking here about the 600, 700, 800s, and the priests were illiterate. Well, they were only taught how to say the Mass. And if they know how to say the Mass, then that's good enough, because that was the only role that they were supposed to perform, or the sacraments. So Vincent de Paul had found out that the priest did not know even the formula of absolution. So he had to reform the clergy. This was also the time when private masses proliferated. Some of the priests were precisely ordained to celebrate the private masses, owing to the different intentions for which masses were said. Do you remember when we talk about the relics and the saints? So people would come to the monasteries or would come to the dioceses or the churches and would say, I'd like you to pray for someone because I have a special devotion to Saint Alvinus or Saint Sandra or Saint Darrell. I'd like you to pray for this particular person. Here's an offering for this particular mass, and the priest would say, "Okay, I will do it." Then he goes to the inside the church and sees the mass by himself. That was the private mass, and he was ordained to do that. So he does that. I don't know whether he understood the Latin that he was reciting, but anyway, he said that mass. Okay, so the theology of the Eucharist took also a turn towards the sacrificial part of the Eucharist, of the Mass, allowing people to request for Masses offered for particular intentions or in honor of a particular saint, especially in places where his or her relic is to be found. And that's the beginning of what we call intentions at Mass. I would like you to pray for this particular intention at Mass. And it became part of private Masses. So, if you have so many intentions, how many Masses do you think the priest would say? Well, depending on the number of intentions. And if, for example, you get a substantial amount for one particular intention, who are you to join with another intention? So you'll say one Mass, two Masses, three Masses, four Masses, private. Anyway, there are no singing. I can say the private Mass by myself. I can have as many Masses as I'm able to celebrate in the privacy of my own room or in the privacy of the church. Okay. So that's the beginning of what we call the private Masses. The net result, people did not have to be present when the priest could very well take care of their intentions. So the celebration of the Eucharist became more and more the act of the priest, more than the act at which the actual community participates. People will always say, "Oh, no, the church is there." Represented by whom? Well, of course, the priest represents also the community in a vague way, not in a physical way. Okay, because you are the only one there. Or if you happen to have a sacristan, he also represents the church. So the sacristan had a special role. He represented the church. That's why when the priest says Dominus Vobiscum, sacristan has to know how to answer. Et cum spiritu tuo. Oh. If he doesn't know how to answer, then he didn't represent the church. Was it that way? Okay. Because the priest could say it privately, he could very well say it in a low voice, with his back to the people, and in a language the people do not necessarily understand. Okay? So, private Masses, quiet Masses, the priest, his back to the people. You remember, those of you who are coming from Southern Leyte, the Ad Orientem Masses, back to the people, and in language like Latin that the people did not necessarily understand. Why? Well, the priest is saying that Mass, so God will understand it. So you're saying the Mass for God. Okay? You're not saying the Mass for the people. Well, only for the intention of the people. But for them to understand what I'm saying, they don't have to do that. They don't have to understand what I'm saying. Even if I'm just trying to make up the prayers, they don't have to understand. Okay. Now, see, that's the problem with private Masses. A problem with private Masses. Because you had removed the Masses from the experience of the community. Imagine in a private Mass in the cathedral. I remember one time going to the cathedral in Naga, the old cathedral in Naga. What shocked me was, of course, all throughout the sides were small altars, with what we call side altars. And at that time, when I went there, it was the time of the Second Vatican Council, but the reform of the Second Vatican Council was not yet, enforced. There were priests who were saying Masses at the same time in those places. But they could say those masses because they are said quietly. So there was always an assistant, there was always an acolyte in those different masses. So as many as 10 priests are saying masses on the side altars. Do you see that nowadays? You don't see that, so you would not know what it looks like. But it was really interesting. Aside from that, there was mass going on in the middle of the altar, middle of the church, in the main altar, with the singing and everything. Okay. So there's a difference between the East and in the West beginning to surface, not only on the matter of Roman primacy, but especially on the matter of the way we look at things in terms of church order, church organization, as well as spirituality. In general, Eastern spirituality more reliant on spirit-centered kind of a spirituality, whereas the church in the West is much more institutional, much more hierarchical, explicitly hierarchical, because of the Roman Empire, the influence of the Roman Empire. So, a kind of a summary, types of ministry. You have the bishops, the presbyters, you have the priests. The bishop as a community leader, cultic leader, and administrator. The presbyters as community elders, advisors of bishops, delegates of bishops or certain rights. And then priests were helpers, extension of the bishops, ultimately the cultic leaders. The ecclesiological framework valid from the autonomous local church into the hierarchical church, the presbyters or the community of elders as belonging to the community, but then the priests are becoming part of the hierarchical church, and now priests becoming a state of life. The justification, theological justification or pastoral justification, the bishop was the center of unity in the local church. They were chosen by the community, and he is a leader because he is also the leader of the community. He's a cultic leader because he's the leader of the community. When ordination was required to celebrate in order for one to celebrate the Eucharist, then he doesn't necessarily have to be a cultic, a leader, a community leader. The presbyters started out as wise men, assisting the bishops, but now they were chosen by the community, and then eventually they served by example. When they became priests, they became mostly cultic leaders or by ordination. As far as the deacons, this is what they had. First, right hand of the bishop, and then occasional liturgical assistant only. According to the three-level church order of Ignatius of Antioch of presbyteroi, episcopoi, presbyteroi, and diaconoi. So the deacons were relegated to the menial roles from their previous role, which was very biblical, the role of Stephen and the other 7 deacons of Rome, which was a very, very prestigious kind of responsibility. The martyrs, however, were different because they were martyrs they were leaders by example and by witness, which again testifies to the ecclesiology, which is much more centered around charisms. The ministry of the martyrs was basically a matter of witnessing with one's life, just the ideal kind of ministry. Taking their place, of course, were the monks, who were also, in a way, charismatic part of the charismatic church, except that eventually the charismatic part of the church were institutionalized when these monk leaders became the bishops and the missionaries in different parts of Europe. Okay, so their ministry was much more in the context of the spiritual way, and you can see this very, very much, especially in the evolution of the sacrament of penance and reconciliation. So, overall summary for this first millennium. Historical context: we have a movement from Jesus to Judaism and the Roman Empire, to the destruction of Rome, and then revival, and the rise of medieval Christendom, and especially monasticism, the special role of monasticism, but also in the context of feudalism. From the social anthropological context, We have from a small group to a majority in the Roman Empire, from being a threat to Rome to being the part and eventually the ruler in Rome, from being a small gatherings to an imperial councils and edicts, from a small intimate group to a more universal sense of belonging, from a community involvement kind of power holders to a hierarchical decision led power holders. So the power now was dictated by a person who, yes, a person who basically is on the top. From the ecclesiological theological context, you are talking from the community of the church of Jesus' followers to believers in a universal church, the body of Christ, to an imperial institution with both spiritual and temporal powers, from basically laical, which the majority are lay people, and only a few are chosen ministers, to cleric-centered church. From a theological justification for new organizational structure to something that is constantly offered because the organization is changing, becoming more and more. So you will have to make a kind of a justification for appointing somebody and giving him the title of very reverend or most reverend or right reverend. So you kind of, is that a theological justification or a canonical justification or just you know whatever justification? In terms of pastoral ministerial developments, we have the community from community chosen leaders to specifically ordained cultic leaders, from leaders of households to administrators and cultic leaders, basilical leaders, from charismatic leaders to well-connected noble heirs and power wielders, from life witness, martyrs, to state of life, priests, monks, to spiritual models. Okay, how do we evaluate the first millennium? There are two core issues. Basically, you're talking about two parallel issues. The regnum or imperium, which is the Roman Empire, and sacerdotium, which is the church, basically, but the more hierarchical church. That's one part, and the other one would be between the uh, hierarchical church, sacerdotium, and the lay people. Now, when the imperium, when the empire and the church were united, they invoked the privilege of being of divine origin. Aha! Why are you the emperor? Why are you the pope? Why are you the bishop? It is by the will of God that I have become an emperor or that I have become a bishop. When the imperium and the regnum, was separated from the sacerdotium, in other words, nag-away, they fought, they were in conflict, then the sacerdotium, the church would say, oh, you imperial power, emperor, you are no longer deprived, you no longer have a divine origin. Only me, only the church has divine origin. See, beautiful power politics. Now, in regard to the politics between the ordained clergy, sacerdotium, and the non-ordained, the lay people, according to the theological justification again, was that this order, the order of the priests higher than the lay people, is something that is divinely ordained structure. This is what God wants. So you have to respect that. Okay? That is how the first millennium had turned out, to be more cleric-centered, priest-centered, rather than ordinary people-centered. So the slow process of lay depositioning. In other words, the lay people have less and less say in the church. Not only that, they are going to be the docents. They're going to be the ecclesia docents, only the part of the church that will have to listen. Your duty is to listen, not to talk. You just listen. And then after listening, then you follow and actualize and implement. You don't talk. The one who talks is the ecclesia disciens, the teaching church, which is the cleric. Okay. And this took place through deprivation of education. Of course, the church did not deprive them, but it was just part of the dissolution of the Roman Empire, that they could not take care of the population, so they were not educated. So only the church ministers had the prerogative of being educated. Therefore, there was no longer lay spirituality. Who would take care of lay spirituality? They are in the world. The world is full of sinners. They are in the world. There's no such thing as lay spirituality. The one who has a spirituality are the religious and the priestly. Yeah, they are the ones who are the spiritual. Okay. So now there grew a misinterpretation of discipleship as only pertaining to the special groups, to the state of life of the clergy, of the monks, eventually the religious, only some sisters, especially contemplative sisters, those apostolic sisters like the Daughters of Charity. Well, okay, we can understand. Maybe they have a special call to religiosity. Maybe. But especially the monks and the religious and the bishops. Yeah. They are really disciples. You lay people, well, aguanta. Okay? So this is where we finish. Again,